Hi, I'm Maggie Ibrahim with World Vision UK. I wanted to pick up on Harjeet's and Lindsay and, well, a lot of the speakers actually mentioning the political economy approach. And I wanted to bring some experiences that I've been having within World Vision, because I see this political economy tension within my own organization constantly. And I feel it when because I'm a DRR resilience practitioner, but I also advocate within the policy fora. So looking at the World Humanitarian Summit, looking at the SDGs and other, if we localize it, and for me this is where the battle becomes very strong, is in our early warning preparedness work, which cuts across our humanitarian work, which cuts across our development work, and then it cuts into the policy advocacy in all of these elements, whether it's the SDGs or the UNISDR system and the UNFCCC. It's all about contingency planning and other. And what I've been trying to do is to ground conversation in indicators as much as I can that link into statistical indicators that are already being collected. Because what we often forget is that for a practitioner all the way up to a finance minister, they need to report on so many different things. And how to do that in a way that increases coherence is, very little simple suggestions that actually is what people need. So although I have so many other things that I would want to highlight today in terms of climate change and other, is around contingency planning, linking development, linking DRR into development, linking DRR into humanitarian emergency response, and linking that into finance mechanisms that finance ministers can use. We need to be very smart on how we advocate, and that's all of our responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll take 2 or 3 questions at a cluster, so why don't you go next?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm Ed King from RTCC Climate News. We've been covering this deal a bit, and I have to say it's kind of perplexed me a lot because no one seems to know about it. There's no money. There are no implementation rules. It's been built in a silo. It has no link, seeming, as Harjeet said in his inimitable style, to sort of climate science. I mean, from a layman's perspective, this seems like the worst deal ever. I mean, it seems like an utter waste of money unless you're working in the industry or you're a bureaucrat. So could the panel try and sell this to me? It's not your job, I know, but the UN aren't doing a very good job. So perhaps you guys can sell this to me and really explain, so I can explain to my readers what on earth the point of this deal is. And perhaps Ursula could also tell us how much the UK is spending on this deal. I mean, what kind of funding is the UK government giving to this deal that no one knows about?
Okay, Ed, thank you. Well, I think first of all, thank you for covering to a certain extent this event already, but it is puzzling. So Ursula, I guess you're on the record, so you need to be conscious of that. But I'm sure Ed has provoked us. Let's take a couple more comments. Tom wants to say something. Is anybody else this side? Maybe Tom, and then we can pick up on some of these first issues.
Thank you, Sam. And raised my hand after kind of Ed's comment there. I feel as if I should put some kind of response as well. I spent some time talking to those involved the other day who in the UNFCCC process, particularly those delegations and people who've been talking about an adaptation goal. Which, for those of you who don't know, is kind of beginning to kind of bubble up as a potential option for the agreement in Paris that, sitting alongside a long-term mitigation goal, there would be a long-term adaptation goal. And the people who were responding to me said, oh, aren't you so lucky working on that Sendai process, where there are these 7 targets that are specific, there's very few options around them, that they really give clarity and guidance to everybody about what they need to do, and you can build an indicator framework. If only we could have that level of coherence and specificity. And I thought to myself, I've just been spending the last 2 years on kind of bemoaning the fact that there's been, incoherence, there's not the connections between the different processes. And yet, in some ways, it was a kind of a shot in the arm to say that, maybe we shouldn't be quite as negative in terms of finding that kind of coherence. And therefore, the Sendai process itself does have these 7 targets that are still, obviously, of course, under negotiation. but are a significant step forward from where we were before in terms of providing real levels of specificity. Some of that really actually directly coherent with what's in the SDGs. If you look at the areas under building resilience in infrastructure, and you look at where there's talk about economic losses and mortality reduction, and there's actually a reasonably high level of coherence between those two areas. Now, of course, we would want more, and fully agree with Lindsay that there needs to be much more specificity in terms of what coherence means. And I think something that in ODI we've continually challenged the likes of DFID and others to say, well, you talk about wanting coherence, but coherence is more than just saying, oh, well, there are these other things going on. And at the moment, we've barely got in the text, there's these other things going on type statement, and we now need to get down to the details of that. So I think where we can see real added value is actually the specificity in an area of work that is absolutely crucial to the climate change arena. It's absolutely crucial to the development arena, and it's crucial to the humanitarian area. Partly the reason why Sendai then is so interesting is because it becomes a lens through which you can begin to test and look at these other processes. DRR is one of those things that fortuitously integrates those other three processes that kind of come after it. I wanted to make a comment about finance. A lot of people have talked about finance. To my mind, we started out this process and there were lots of people saying, oh, wouldn't it be nice if this process was firewalled from all that other horrible politics there is around finance in these other processes? And wouldn't it be lovely if it was firewalled from some of those horrible loss and damage debates that there are at the UNFCCC? And, can't we find a way through this by making sure everybody focuses on what's needed practically? And of course, rather predictably, that kind of fell apart quite quickly, and the kind of all those horrible politics are now meshed into the Sendai process, and that many people are seeing Sendai as an opportunity to rehearse some of those arguments and some of that politics to come in other processes later in the year, which means it's a slightly odd one in some ways, because you hear G77 countries saying, well, maybe we shouldn't push this finance thing too hard in Sendai because it might hamstrung us when we come to Paris and start asking for more money, and let's try and kind of second guess ourselves. And this whole kind of gaming of negotiations is being played out in Sendai too, and that makes it more complicated for those like Ursula who are trying to kind of find a way through this process, and for really the nature of how delegations build themselves in each of these processes. I think where we do have this real problem, though, in Sendai, and where I'm a little bit scared, is the extent to which this push on finance and the extent to which the finance push is predicated on an argument that says greenhouse gases are now causing more extreme events are causing more disasters, and we haven't released those greenhouse gases, and therefore you should pay us for the damages caused, is one that is being reiterated through the Sendai process, and one that therefore that kind of threatens to bring the loss and damage adaptation finance discussion squarely into the centre. The problem we have there is that actually risk reduction will not be achieved through small standalone projects, through international public cooperation or development assistance transfers. It will be achieved by integrating risk reduction into large-scale investment flows, primarily of the private sector and of those down the road here that deal with finance. And so it's how DRR is featured in the $6 trillion of infrastructure investment that will change nature of risk, not whether or not DFID increases its spending on DRR by 50% in the next 8 years to be a tiny speck on that landscape. But of course it matters a lot in terms of UNFCCC politics and in terms of trust between states. But this is where fundamentally we're getting this tension between what the international sphere wants and the politics of relationships between government and actually what's needed on the ground.
Thank you, Tom, for that, providing some answers and your fears as well. Ursula, would you like to pick up on these challenges that are flying around?
Certainly. I think, and I am on the record, and we are still negotiating, so I preface my comments with that caveat. I think, Tom, your comments are right about the balance that does need to be struck here. Certainly, I think there's a degree of inevitability that, because we're not the only country looking at the full arc of global processes that are going to be happening over the next 18 months, that it was unrealistic to expect that there won't be a certain degree of rehearsal of arguments and rehearsal of positions in Sendai, which is, I suppose, the first big one on the calendar. That has presented, I think, some challenges for us as the UK. I think specifically around the issue of finance, which a lot of people here have raised today and are questioning. But I think our position has been that we do see the finance for development tract as the key area we can make a difference, and we can make those arguments around the necessity of the real step change that does need to happen in terms of financing disaster risk reduction and the implementation of the framework and beyond. So caveating this and choosing my language very carefully, I think I can't really tell you how much we've spent on Sendai, so sorry to your readers on that in that regard. But what I can indicate is our intent. Our intent is clearly behind promoting an increase in investment in this area. Our Secretary of State, Justine Greening, has on a number of occasions in many forums, including the Political Champions Group, which is a high-level group which she co-chairs with Helen Clark, has pressed on this idea of the need for increased focus on disaster risk reduction and resilience more broadly, but also on the need for increased investment. That can't happen, as Tom says, in isolation in terms of just DFID or the UK saying this is what we're going to do, we're going to up our spend by 50, 60, 100% or whatever. That requires a real concerted effort from not just the donor countries or traditional donor partners, but from everybody involved, from right down to the recipients, beneficiaries, etc. So that's not, I think we need to appreciate also that the HFA, the Hyogo framework, its successor, what comes out of Sendai, these are voluntary frameworks that you want countries and you want people to be signed up to that and committed to delivering on. So there's always going to be an element of compromise, if you like, of horse trading in negotiations, but I think what we need to look to is the positives that come out of this. This sends a strong signal about the intent of states, about their intentions with regards to partnerships, not just with other states, but also, as others mentioned, particularly with the private sector. This is a huge area that is untapped in our view, or not tapped enough, that we need to be pressing on. So I recognise that there's a disappointment that you're not going to be getting pledges out of countries at Sendai saying, here's a few extra billion or whatever. But I think it's always been unrealistic to expect that. I think the proper forum is the financing for development, because that links very clearly to our idea about disaster risk reduction needing to be mainstreamed. We're talking about a different process, and it's my final point. We're talking about a different legal status in regards to the UNFCCC process. That is a treaty process that, I think Harjeet mentioned the word obligations. That's very different from the voluntary commitments that we're looking to do here. So Sendai is a steer, a really clear steer, we hope. And certainly the targets and indicators regime that will emerge from that, I think, is the key thing that will catch people's eye in those other processes, and will allow us to kind of build on that. It's not waiting for the outcome of each of these processes and then deciding what to do. It's saying that there's a cumulative effect, and we need to be starting with Sendai and making our way into the World Humanitarian Summit and emerging out of that with a really strong, not just a narrative, but a really strong proposal for implementation across this agenda.
Thank you, Ursula. Lindsay, you want to comment?
Yeah, I guess just on Ed's comment in the why is HFA 2 and the Sendai process actually relevant. And I think, a lot of those points that you raised are relevant. It is a weak process. Not many people know about it. It's very limited to the DRR community. But it is important in the sense that it lays out a list of principles or core guiding arms that governments have agreed to in how they wish to deliver disaster risk reduction. And it's more important in the sense that if you look at what will come out or likely to come out of the SDG process, where you'll have a target very likely on resilience and climate extremes, which is very related which will be associated with DRR. Now, if you don't, well, essentially, if you just look at the SDGs, there's very little in there to guide how you deliver that target. And this is why it's so important to be able to link across the different frameworks, because delivering that target through the best principles, or not necessarily the best principles, but the principles agreed upon by each government through the HFA process is a very good starting point. If you don't have that process in place, then there's very little guidance, and each country is on a whim to choose how it wants to deliver on those specific targets. So it's not perfect, it's not legally binding, it's very narrow, but if you can do it properly, it really does add value. I think it adds value in the kind of the details of how you actually do the implementation of good DRR.
Thanks, Lindsay. Now, before I go back to other panellists, I'd like to stir up a few more questions, particularly those online. I don't think I can see any coming in yet, so please, those who are listening, send us your thoughts in brief and any questions for the panel you may have. But in the room, I have Virginia Murray who wants to make a comment. So, Virginia, there's a mic coming.
My name is Virginia Murray. I'm the Vice Chair of the Science and Technical Advisory Group for UNISDR, but I'm also work for Public Health England, where I'm a consultant in global disaster risk reduction. My final task is that I'm a member of the major group on science and technology, and I've had the incredible privilege of being an observer to much of the negotiations process. We were allowed between July and October to contribute to some of the debates, but most of it has been driven by member states. And I think you must recognise that the member states have had an incredibly powerful role taking on what the regional platforms in disaster risk reduction in 2014 agreed. And I see that Emily is here, who was in the Americas debate, and there was a huge amount of comment about much of the discussion that you've had, Hajid and Ben. I think for me, the word science has come through so much more powerfully. Lindsay, thank you for picking that up. Science, technology, innovation, adaptation are all words that are much more clearly understood and will be much more available for use in the future. And I think these are the ways that we're going to link much more easily to the other UN landmark agreements. As an observer, I think the targets and indicators debate has been particularly fascinating, and out of that has come a request for much clearer discussion on terminology. And I think one of the things that whatever happens at Sendai, it is likely there will be a continuing role to discuss the words, what they mean, from mortality, morbidity, to death, to affected, all the way through to some of the financing concerns that are being raised by you, Hajid and Lindsay, are things that will continue probably until December 2016. But your comments, Hajid, about no reflection of the AR5 and of the SREX reports from IPCC, I agree, but it was agreed that really the whole purpose of the preamble was just to tell the story, not to try and link to many other fora, although it was discussed. But with the Global Assessment Report being launched in New York tomorrow and at the Royal Society on Thursday, I think you will see a lot of the things that you're worried are missing actually within the evidence base that has been used to try and support the negotiations. And some of that discussion is very clearly within the Science and Technical Advisory Group report that will be launched in Sendai on using science for disaster risk reduction. I think these negotiations, therefore, are really the bare bones that Ursula's been talking about. I think there has been some surprising lessons in horse trading that I've been watching with fascination, as you describe it, Ursula. But actually, it's been a learning point to see how many countries are really determined that disaster risk reduction should be mainstreamed and should be at the core of the work that they want to do in the future, recognising it's a voluntary framework, but could have a global difference. Thank you, Sam.
Virginia, maybe Harjit, you wish to comment on that. I mean, I think what I'm hearing is, you know, it's kind of a sense at this stage, is the glass going to be half full or half empty? There's a huge progress over what's happened. I think you're making the case, Virginia, about the science aspects. I don't know how they were previously reflected in HFA1, but I mean, I think there has been a major advance in policy
engagement in this respect. But the challenges are still massive, and Harjeet, you flagged those in your intervention earlier. Do you want to comment on any of the questions and observations, Harjeet, and then I'll go to you, Ben?
Sure. Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Linking with what Ed and Virginia said, I also agree with Tom and others that UNISDR is a key player and can play a very important role going forward. I think what we need is clarity on our role. And if I have to describe, UNFCCC right now, and when it comes to adaptation, is still wondering about what, and hasn't reached a stage where it starts talking about how to. Whereas UNISDR has crossed that boundary long ago and knows a lot about how to. But I think UNISDR has, if I can use the word, failed to project itself as a champion of how to. And the tone still seems to be very defensive. And I think that needs to change. I hope in Sendai we have a much more aggressive stance of saying we know how to do risk reduction. We have years and decades of experience behind us, and we know how it works. And that's where the whole talk of science and local knowledge and experiences that we have of working locally, bringing national governments together and bringing all these international frameworks together. I think that needs to be articulated. And the advantage that UNISDR has, of course, we all understand the political issue, the way they come in and how governments do that. And one can have very little control when you are dealing with 160 plus governments here at UNISDR and 190 plus there at UNFCCC and other processes. But I think we should use that advantage. I see the legality or obligation of a particular framework and the progress one can make is more like a seesaw progress, a seesaw system, more inversely proportional. We have seen, because UNFCCC is more about obligation and the legal framework, things move extremely slow. And while we have seen a lot of progress on the ground and at the government level, I know a lot has to be done there, but UNSDR has been able to move things. So I think that also needs to be recognized. And I'm glad to hear that the whole reference to IPCC is going to be there in the Global Assessment Report. But I think that's still not sufficient. The role UNSDR can clearly play is about how is on defining how to. And if I need to articulate, I would say UNSDR should be facilitating, enabling, and promoting the implementation of multi-hazard and multidisciplinary approaches through local communities. And of course, that's where your role is, to encourage national governments and come up with very clear guidelines and modules and processes that can help national governments and regional bodies to do the implementation part. I think that's what the strong point of UNSDR is.
Ben, would you like to comment at this stage?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I would. Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's good.
Am I hearing? Okay. Yeah. Just four very rapid points. Starting first of all with the question of the global assessment of disaster risk reduction that will be launched tomorrow, and then the Royal Society day after tomorrow, as Virginia said. As is the case with many of you, I've been involved providing background papers and so forth for a number of these GARs. And look, the fact is that I'm not even sure the senior management of ISDR even reads it, let alone, or perhaps they read it. I don't think they understand it. I have not seen any of the insights from 2009 onwards actually implemented. And this goes back to something that I believe, maybe Lindsay or Harjeet said much earlier on, is that unlike the IP, there is no mechanism within UNISDR for annual or biannual review and serious modification, an internal learning process. So the GAR is wonderful. The GAR 15 will actually talk about sociopathic arbitrage. That is, it actually lays the blame for risk construction, right, at the door of finance capital. Well, I mean, that's in fact true, and it's a massive insight. I don't think we're actually going to see that GAR insight percolate through into the daily work. Also, Harjit mentions the track record, the fact that the UNISDR has, say, mud on its boots. It has established relationships with governments. Yes, I would argue it doesn't have mud on its boots, however. It doesn't have established relationships with civil society or with the least powerful. Lindsay said we really should connect with the most powerful people, presidents of Uganda and Ethiopia and so forth. I would argue we also need to collect with the least powerful. And to that extent, I would agree that, I mean, the good news is the UNISDR has good relationships with cities. There's a network of cities. That's really an excellent foundation to build upon. I'm really skeptical about the superficial high-level relationships with national governments, and I'll come back to that in a moment. If we do take the least powerful into account, and if we take local knowledge into account and local science into account within the definition of science, and I don't think Virginia Murray would disagree with me, there is a good deal of science, albeit uncertified science, that's done, empirical observation that people make in their home environments. And I think in hybridization, a co-production of knowledge from the outside in, from the inside out, is the way to go. If we take that point of view, then in fact, we come to the most exciting part of this. And I think when I talked about the stone monkey returning after Sendai, this is what I meant. It's the indicator regime. And here I agree completely with Ursula. We're talking about a cumulative process. We're talking about the possibility that the indicator regime can actually take on board people's own perceptions, the everyday risks, the organic linkages between those everyday risks and disaster risk reduction, and move forward in a very substantial and concrete way, providing indicators that the SDGs, the MDGs, and the climate change adaptation regimes can utilize together with DRR. Two other very quick points. Money, finance. Look, my experience over the years, and we're talking about nearly 50 years in this business now, is that the money may be copious, but it remains at the national level. There is a rhetoric of decentralization in countries around the world. The money does not get down to the local government units where they can build partnerships with communities. There has to be something within these new finance regimes that insists that governments actually share the finance with local government units. Of course, accountability is an issue, but that is not rocket science. That can be done. Finally, and this is the point at which I think various national government ninjas will be attempting to assassinate me, but I have this poltergeist here to protect me. I want to say that in my own empirical research in Tanzania, and I've recently published this, it's online, it's with Geoforum, is that the rhetoric of climate change has been used in a number of countries to justify massive land grabs. And these land grabs further impoverish people, further undermine people's own ability to cope with climate change spontaneously and to deal with development issues and everyday risks. In Tanzania, we're talking about the Southern Corridor Project, which is inviting massive amounts of agribusiness investment from around the world to basically carve out a huge territory for industrial agriculture that would displace farmers and make them wage slaves. It's tremendously controversial within Tanzania. However, my own president was there last year with a jumbo jet full of agribusiness and pharmaceutical chemical company executives praising this initiative. The rhetoric being used is that, oh, we have to save Tanzania from starvation. So what we have to do is invite agribusiness in. We have to modernize agriculture. Give me a break. There's an enormous literature about land grabs. I'll leave it at that. I think this is yet another dark side of the language that is coined and recoined every 10 years, okay? And those of us who've been through this movie several times, these disappointing decades of development in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and so forth, know that the emperor actually is simply changing costumes. But they're diaphanous, they're transparent. The emperor remains naked. We have to see that. We have to actually confront these land grabs, confront the reality that capitalism worldwide is killing us, is killing the planet.
Ben, thank you very much. Yeah, it's quite a good move from DRR to critique capitalism, but I think actually it's what everyone's been saying. It's about how the HFA sits into broader development processes. So I think you're expressing that. I have a question from Megan Rowling here, who's Ed's sort of co-worker in crime in the media side in Thomson Reuters Foundation, which does raise the question of really a similar question to yours, really, Ed, around why does HFA2 matter, really, and how badly it's communicated. What Megan is saying, and I don't think I've got all of her message, so forgive me, Megan, if this isn't quite what you've wanted to say, but DRR should be seen as something that is much more relevant to people's lives, like climate change, she writes. But why is it still seen as a distant thing that's hard to explain and full of jargon? HFA2 seems unlikely to help much here. So, yes, a bunch of people will go to Sendai. There will be some side events that may be a little bit more intelligible than the advanced, unedited version. But still there's an issue about communicating, embedding this DRR into development practice and people's daily lives and experiences. For those of you in the room or others on the panel, tell us why it does matter and how it can matter and how we can get better at communicating this. Let me go over here to this gentleman before I come back to you.
Hi, my name is Ian Hanna from Atkins. I've been a flood risk management professional for 30 years or so, and fairly new onto the DRR profession or sector, so I can bring some sort of interesting observations. I think first off, DRR and climate change adaptation, I've got to say from where I'm sitting, they're not different. They might not be the same, but they're not different. At the end of the day, climate change is going to make disasters worse. It is making disasters worse. So when I'm looking to do work, actually I don't mind who or what the justification for the funding is. I just want to get on and improve matters. So where does Sendai sit in that? I think it's great because you're promoting concerns about disaster risk relief. Whether we do something slightly different under climate change, so be it. But I think as a general good for the world, it's a good thing. I think someone said, has anyone done any HFA improvements? Well, yes, we do. We're doing projects now where we are measuring our performance against the HFA plan, and we're measurably making a difference on those fronts. So again, if anybody will question, has it got any value? I think the industry, from where I'm sitting, is interested in what's going to happen at Sendai. We're nervous because of the mismatch between the two. I then just want to say something a little bit about funding, and I can't agree, and I think, Ben, you sort of supported this, that it's all going to be made good by the private sector, because I just don't see it. If you look at what happens to address disaster risk reduction, it is all about science, knowledge, and then some sort of infrastructure improvement. But we're talking about where people flood, where people sit on earthquakes, where people sit below mud floods. These are the things that exist. The private sector isn't going to help those matters. If you tell them to build a city somewhere else or develop an agricultural somewhere else, yeah, they'll bundle in there and say it's the best thing, it's all sustainable, but they won't deal with the day-to-day issue. So we do have to see government funding, high-level funding, World Bank, this sort of thing, to make that happen. So I think those are really the 2 points. Yeah, it does make a difference to us. We do like HFI, but we don't really care whether it's called HFA or CCA. But the money side of it, let's see the funding going the right places.
Yeah. Yes. Can you build on those points or relation to the
Well, I want
challenge?
to answer the question that Megan proposed and answer it based on the people that I serve, really. This is children and youth. And I think they're awesome at communicating why this is important. Okay. And Megan, we've got press releases coming out. We've got the Children in a Changing Climate Coalition have examples and guidelines addressing one of the points here made by Ben, I believe, and Harjeet about what UNISDR can do is provide implementation guidelines. So the CCC, the Children in a Changing Climate Coalition, have those guidelines, and we've got beautiful voices from the children and youth saying, why does this matter? I can read some of them out, but I don't think we've got very much time for that, so I won't.
Yeah,
but I will give you business cards.
Yeah,
yes.
No, that's great to direct us to it. Thank you for highlighting that, because that's an extremely good, helpful answer.
I'm in on to answer Megan's question if you like.
Yeah, go ahead, Harjeet.
Yeah, I think the critical role UNISDR can play, if I don't get into the 23, 24-page long the document or whatever the final shape would be, I think the key message that we need to drive home, and UNISDR needs to really work hard on that along with all of us, is how risk assessment and planning to reduce risk is important part of our daily lives and anything and everything that we do. I think putting risk at the at the center or at the radar of the whole development process is something that UNISDR needs to continue to work on. When we stay in a hotel, at the backside of the door, there's a very clear, map. In good hotels, you always find that this is where you are and this is the escape route. When we fly, every time we are told how to evacuate and what we have to do when we are in crisis. I think, HFA did talk about culture of safety, but I don't think we have gone ahead in actually imbibing that culture of safety in our daily lives. And especially now when climate change and many more complexities that we are seeing, including the new challenges or new risks that the private sector is also creating, I think it's about understanding, analyzing risks that we face now and in future, and then making sure that our development interventions are addressing that. And that's where finding the risk language and resilience language in SDGs and climate change and everywhere is going to be extremely important. And those messages need to be simplified, amplified, and disseminated across. And whether we are working with children, youth, elderly, whoever, I think that's where the role of regulation comes in, the role of personal attitude in our lives comes in.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
Could I add just a footnote to what Harjeet said? Yeah. Is that possible? Among the other missing references in the HFA is to an enormous experience gathered in the field of public health that Virginia Murray knows very well on risk behavior. And I think the important thing about what Harjeet said is that we have to realize that ordinary people are constantly juggling threats and opportunities. Now, it might seem to the project manager, the budget manager, the bureaucrat, that a concern with everyday risk is a distraction, is a dilution, is a real implementation problem. But here's just one example from the pilot work that's ongoing by Global Network. In Honduras, on the side of a hill that's prone to landslides and flooding, one of the most frequently mentioned concerns was crimes against property, that is theft. A woman who has a sewing machine in her house and sews and sells clothing items, school uniforms, etc., to add to the complex livelihood of that household. When drug-addicted gang youth break in and steal her sewing machine, the household is denied income. The knock-on effect is that they have less income to invest in floodproofing. They have absolutely no hope in saving money, so they can actually take advantage of a house plot in a safer area that is on offer by the municipality. So you see, each and every one of these, including, for instance, this litmus test, I think that would sort of make steam pour out of the ears of a bureaucrat. Crime. How could theft, petty theft by drug-addicted gangs, how could that actually be included together with landslide in a indicator regime, in a, as Ursula said, a maximally comprehensive approach to development and poverty reduction? Well, clearly the example I gave shows the linkages. And I think one of the work as it goes forward in Global Network under the rubric of frontline is developing a methodology that can actually do that.
Thank you.
I hope that example helps to clarify.
No, that's good. I think it links to the issue about Sendai sitting in the framework of the SDGs and financing, so I think that's a good example. Now, we have a last round for questions online and in the room, and I'm going to go to Emily, and then we'll wrap up after that.
Emily Wilkinson from ODI. So just picking up on the point, I mean, if it's really about the private sector and government investing differently, I wondered if the panelists had views. It's quite a big question, really, and maybe we haven't got enough time to go into detail, but how a non-binding agreement can really include stronger language around accountability and incentives for both those types of stakeholders to invest differently, to take risk reduction into account. What kind of language and what kinds of incentives do you think should be specified and included in this kind of agreement to promote that kind of action?
That's a super question, Emily, and yes, it's a bit late in our session to throw it in, but Ursula, your government department talks very strongly about the private sector being an agent for poverty reduction and economic growth. How can this be woven into it in a convincing way to deal with our colleagues from Atkins to really get the public-private partnership to deliver?
Thanks. Yes, it was a very big question. I'm going to perhaps disappoint you in providing us a rather short answer, but I think the key phrase that we look at from a different perspective is on that very point about partnership. I don't think, we don't agree that there is no role for government or there is no role for the private sector. It is very much a partnership that we're looking for, and in a framework like the one that will emerge from Sendai, the challenge is getting good language that really provides guidance and a steer to both government and to the members of the private sector and stakeholders in that group, that encourages them to work together and promotes that approach. The difficulty, as you say, with a framework that isn't legally binding is what incentives can you place there. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the incentive of self-interest, particularly the private sector has a tremendous self-interest in safeguarding its assets, reducing its own exposure, its supply lines, etc., and its overall contribution to society and our economic growth. So I think that couching it in language that is familiar both to government and to the private sector in all its forms, we shouldn't be looking at the private sector as a kind of monolith here. We should be recognising its diversity. That's the challenge, and the hope is that we can get framework language in the new agreement that sets us on the right path. This is the beginning, I think. In this process, it's not something where we'll say we will present what the solution is and now you go off and implement it. So I think it really is about partnership from that score and incentivising that partnership by speaking to people's interests, both common and individual.
Thank you. Lindsay,
I guess just a quick one. It's not an easy question to answer, but I mean, in terms of what language do you use, it has to be the language that the private sector can engage with, and that's speaking about issues of of economic incentives, regulatory frameworks for them to actually invest. It's particularly important for things like long-lived infrastructure, where the implications of actions now are going to be felt, many years into the future. And if you have issues of climate change, other changing pressures, other development drivers that are likely to impact on the delivery of that infrastructure, then there needs to be very, very strong incentives and regulatory frameworks to make sure that you're thinking now about what the implications of that are. And that can be a carrot, it can be a stick, but it has to be there and it has to be included. At the moment, it really isn't in many countries. And we've been doing at the moment a piece of work called Future Climate for Africa, where we've been looking at whether long-term climate information is actually taken on board within these longer-term investments across Africa. And the reality is that it really isn't. There's very, very few incentives, there's very few regulatory frameworks to be pushed for the private sector and for national governments to actually take on board the information that we have already. And that needs to change. And part of that is through the HFA, part of that is through DFID and other donors putting pressure, but it's also, in part it needs to be coming from the bottom up as well. So it needs to be in language that they can understand, but it also needs to be, something that they can engage with in terms of their economic incentives and what they can actually see in terms of getting out of it.
So it can be done. The UN Climate Summit last September, one of its most engaging and interesting sessions was the climate finance session, when you saw major pension funds and private sector, or banks and others, pledging to take action on climate change. So it's not impossible, but that event itself required massive choreography, massive sort of language management, and I think we ourselves, as a community of policy research practitioners, really need to work much harder on this issue of how we communicate and create the right incentives for the private sector, because by and large there are a handful of sort of climate resilience DRR private sector champions, but it's not a very big group, and I think we need to find ways to do that better. So I think the point has been well made. Now I'm aiming to wrap up now, since our lunch has arrived. Since Harjeet and Ben can't engage in the lunch, are there any very short comments you wish to say as a closure? So I go to you first, Harjeet.
I think I've already made key points. What I would like to say as the last point, that I would not like to undermine the importance of UNISDR. They do have a critical role to play, but they need to really find their feet in the resilience sector, which is growing and evolving. And they need to be championing what they can do best. And for me, that's the implementation part, and giving hands-on guidance to countries and bringing together different international players and focusing on multi-sectoral and multi-hazard approach to development. I think that's what their key role is, and that's what they should be championing and focusing on. And I hope I'll see some of you in Sendai to see that happening.
Much for joining us this evening, Harjeet. Ben, any final comments from you, Ben?
Well, having lived, at least in folk imagination, before the 16th century in China, Stone Monkey didn't understand anything I said because the social formation was feudal and not pre-capitalist. Nevertheless, Stone Monkey, I think, is hopefully going to be very active in the post-Sendai period. And I mean that sincerely. One word we haven't heard today is transformation, which is buzzing quite a lot in the climate change adaptation literature. And I think what I'm talking about by monkey business is serious structural transformation. And this is about poverty reduction, yes, but that's putting it in a negative way. One has to assert the right to livelihood, the right to safety as a human right, etc. And I think, and it's, well, and I could go on and eat your lunch and your dinner, but I won't. Bon appetit. Thank you so much for having me here this morning.
Well, no, thank you very much for joining us. I think we will...
I've learned a great deal. And incidentally, I agree completely that with you, Sam, that capitalism is not monolithic, and with Ursula as well. And there are, in fact, some corporate champions. And in the disaster field, I mean, back in the day, in fact, IBM's disaster unit was on the site, with assistance. Ericsson Communication has been, I mean, there are a number of corporations. And so but let's not reason, however, from the exceptions. We have to look at the general tendencies, and I think the general tendency is for corporations to be concerned with business continuity. Absolutely, they're concerned, as are public investors as well, with protecting their assets. There is a reserve army of labor. There's an underclass in the world today, to be perfectly brutal and honest, and it breaks my heart to have to say it, from the point of view of the logic of capital, these people are expendable.
Ben, well, thank you very much for your contributions. I'm glad you brought transformation into the conversation at the end, so that's a good way to go out to our lunch. So thank you to you, to Harjit, to Ursula, thank you very much, and to Lindsay. This has been very good, so I think we should applaud everyone. Thank you.